Morning, all. And this morning we're going to take a look at the St. Louis Blues. For fans of this channel who've been fans since the Stanley Cup playoff run, who may or may not be St. Louis Blues fans, your thought process is awesome. By the time you got to St. Louis, or we've talked a lot about St. Louis this summer. You could have skipped them, people wouldn't have even noticed. So there's one or two reactions I think there could be out there. And then others are kind of like, whatever. So when we look at the St. Louis Blues, we see a team that came into the league in 1967. And they were immediately the most successful of the expansion teams. They went on the run of 3 straight Stanley Cup finals in 68, 69, 70 under coach Scotty Bowman. But the one caveat with that was you had the original 6 on one side of the league and 6 expansion teams on the other. So I've always kind of thrown that as a little asterisk next to the fact that, yes, they got to the Stanley Cup final, but the teams they were playing against weren't original 6 until they got to the final, and that's where they got, kind of schooled. So what happened this past year is truly something special for St. Louis. They finally win the Stanley Cup in 2019. It was the first time they've been back to the final since 1970. And yet playoffs, they're pretty good at making the playoffs. They've done it 42 out of 51 seasons. They didn't make the playoffs in 2006, 2007, and 2008. Made them in 2009 and then missed in 2010 and 2011 as well. So that's 5 out of 6 years they missed the playoffs, and they've only missed them in 9 overall. So pretty darn good run for the St. Louis Blues. And this again is why, and I mentioned this in the Philly video, I'll mention this here, when you start saying, maybe St. Louis doesn't make the playoffs, you sound a little crazy because St. Louis usually makes the playoffs. All-time points leaders, Bernie Federko is number 1 there with 352 goals, 721 assists, 1,073 points. Brett Hull, 527 goals, 409 assists, 936 points. I don't think anybody gets to 527 goals just as a St. Louis Blue. Again, I think that record's pretty safe. Brian Sutter, 303 goals, 333 assists, 636 points. Gary Unger, 292 goals, 283 assists, 575 points. Pavel Demitra, 204 goals, 289 assists, 493 points. Alex Steen, 188 goals, 291 assists, 479 points. David Backes, 206 goals, 254 assists, 460 points. Al McInnes, 127 goals, 325 assists, 452 points. Keith Tkachuk, 208 goals, 219 assists, 427 points. And Vladimir Tarasenko is top 10 now. 211 goals, 207 assists, 418 points. And he's the only one you could look at and say, well, maybe he would score 500 goals at some point. But he's 316 short of Brett Hull. I'm thinking 500 would take him, if he's scoring at an average of 30 a year, it's 15 years plus? I think Brett Hull's goals record is safe. Your all-time wins leaders, it's not Jordan Bennington, surprisingly. Mike Liut, 151. He still leads. Curtis Joseph, 137. Jake Allen, 136. So if Jake Allen wins 2 games as a St. Louis Blue this year, and I think it's a pretty safe bet that he does unless he gets traded, he passes Curtis Joseph. Not only that, but if he wins 16 games this year, he becomes the all-time wins leader for the St. Louis Blues. So this is why when people say, Allen's the worst goalie they've ever had, I go, no. Grant Fuhr, 108 wins. Brian Elliott, 104 wins. So that rounds out your top 5 right there. Coaching wins, Joel Quenneville, 308. Ken Hitchcock, 248. Brian Sutter, 153. Andy Murray, 118. And Scotty Bowman, 110. So it is quite the run this team has had. I would expect Craig Berube to be on this list sooner rather than later. But it's a run that they've had as a team that's been relatively successful most of their time. The biggest thing with St. Louis, and it doesn't show up on the board as much, is that they've been willing to spend money at times, and it's backfired. They've tried building through the draft, and it's had mixed results. They've tried a little bit of everything, and this year it finally worked for them. So, captains. Their list of captains, relatively long, but they've been in the league over 50 years. Al Arbour, 1967 through 71. Red Berenson, 70-71 and 77-78. Jimmy Roberts, 71-72. Barclay Plager, 72 through 76, Gary Unger, 76-77. Barry Gibbs, 78-79. Brian Sutter, 79 to 88. Bernie Federko, 88 to 89. Rick Mahar, 1989-90. Scott Stevens, 90-91. Garth Butcher, 91-92. Brett Hall, 92 through 95. Shane Corson and Wayne Gretzky were both captains of the St. Louis Blues in 95-96. Chris Pronger, 97 through 2002 and 2003-2004. In between, Al McInnes had a year, 02-03 with the captaincy. Dallas Drake, 2005 to 2007. Eric Brewer, 2008 to 2011. David Backus, 2011 to 2016. And Frank Pietrangelo has been their captain from 2016 till now, 2019. So, nice long list and quite a few Hall of Famers in there. I'm not saying Pietrangelo will get there, but yeah, you never know. Hall of Fame is one of those tricky things where sometimes with the right run and the right number of Stanley Cup rings, you can get in there. Top 10 draft picks. Relatively short list for a team that came into the league in 1967. But some of the draft picks they end up trading away end up being top 10 picks. So, we'll get to that. 1968, they draft Gary Edwards at number 6. 1971, drafting 4th, they get Gene Carr. 1972, drafting 9th, they draft Wayne Merrick. 1973, drafting 5th, John Davidson. Yes, that John Davidson. 1976, drafting 7th, Bernie Federko. 1977, drafting 9th, they get Scott Campbell. 1978, drafting 3rd, Wayne Babbage, who was one of my favorite players in the 80s. I know he burned out pretty quick, but he did have a 50-goal season in there. 1979, drafting 2nd, they get Perry Turnbull. 1986, drafting 10th, Jocelyn Lemieux, who scored a few less points than Mario in his career. 1988, drafting 9th, Rod Brindamore. 1989, drafting 9th again, Jason Marshall. 2006, drafting 1st, Eric Johnson. And 2008, drafting 4th, Alex Pietrangelo. So, that's your top 10 draft picks. And like I said, not an overly long list, considering when they came in and comparing it to some of the earlier videos. Keep in mind, 1983 they did not draft. That was around the time that rumor had it they were going to move to Saskatoon. And as soon as the NHL heard that, they went, no. And they stepped in pretty darn quick and found new owners. But they abstained from the draft. And the 1983 draft had some pretty good players in it. So that may have been a mistake in retrospect. But you can also look and say, well, yeah, but they had been giving teams money for draft picks years before that. There were a lot of trades I didn't put on the board that were just, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th draft picks in various drafts, especially 1978, where they were buying draft picks and they were buying later draft picks. So they did that plenty. Maybe in 83 it was like, that didn't work. Forget the draft then. Anyhow, all kidding aside, and it is kidding, February 6, 1971, as we get into the trade part of the video, St. Louis gets Wayne Connolly and Gary Unger. Detroit gets Red Berenson and Tim Ecclestone. Gary Unger, of course, ends up here on the top 10. He ends up 4th in all-time scorers. Gary Unger, one of the best Blues of the 70s. May 25th, 1971, St. Louis gets Peter Macduff. The Rangers get a 1971 first-round pick, which becomes a number 10. And that's Steve Vickers. So Vickers would have been on the board for them, or whoever they would have picked in that draft would have ended up on the board, because that was a top 10 draft pick. May 15th, 1973, St. Louis acquires 1973 first, which becomes John Davidson. The Montreal Canadiens acquire a first in the 1973 draft as well, which is lower down, and they use it to acquire Bob Gainey. A 4th and a 1975 first also included. So for the Montreal Canadiens, I think they were pretty happy with Gainey. I think that made them feel pretty good. And for St. Louis, Davidson was a good goaltender, but he's mostly remembered for what he did with the New York Rangers. March 9th, 1974, St. Louis acquires Dave Gardner. Montreal acquires a first-round draft pick from St. Louis that they used to draft Doug Risebrough. So that's a pretty good trade for Montreal. Again, and you'll see as we go through that when Montreal calls and says we have a draft pick, St. Louis should hang up the phone. June 18th, 1975, St. Louis acquires Jerry Butler, Ted Irvine, and Burt Wilson. The Rangers acquire Bill Collins and John Davidson. This is a large win for the New York Rangers. And, of course, Davidson had only been in the St. Louis organization for 2 years at this point, and they're trading him. The ADD with draft picks was really, really high back then. October 30th, 1975, St. Louis gets Derek Sanderson. The New York Rangers get a 1977 first. It's a top 10, and they draft Lucien Deblois. And Derek Sanderson, it didn't really work out for him in St. Louis. They ended up trading him on February 18th, 1977, so not even 2 years later, for cash from the Vancouver Canucks. So Sanderson winds up in Vancouver, and in order to get Sanderson, St. Louis gave up a top draft pick, which became Deblois. Deblois had a good career. At some point, there'll be a career video with Lucien Deblois. I don't think there's a huge clamoring for that video right now, though. August 18th, 1977. Here we go, trading draft picks with Montreal again. St. Louis gets Jim Roberts. Montreal takes a 1979 third, and that becomes Guy Carbonneau. Carbonneau and Gainey both could have been draft picks for the St. Louis Blues. Boy, could that have changed things in terms of their whole team makeup and everything. August 7th, 1979, St. Louis gets Joe Micheletti. Edmonton gets Tom Rolston and Risto Siltanen. Siltanen, decent enough defenseman for Edmonton, would end up moving on to Hartford. July 3rd, 1981, St. Louis gets Scott Campbell and John Maxwell. Winnipeg gets Paul McLean, Brian Maxwell. John Markell. Sorry, St. Louis gets John Markell and Scott Campbell. Getting ahead of myself there. Winnipeg gets Paul McLean, Brian Maxwell, and Ed Staniowski. McLean's the key name in there. Paul McLean was a pretty darn good goal scorer for Winnipeg. March 9th, 1982, St. Louis gets Glenn Hanlon. Vancouver takes Tony Curry, Rick Hines, Jim Nill, and a 1982 fourth round pick. June 3rd of that year, so not even 3 months later, St. Louis is traded back, or St. Louis has Rick Hines traded back to them, and it's cash going to Vancouver. I remember kind of thinking Rick, like Hines, the Hines ketchup and all the remarks you can make, and he was a Canuck for not even 3 months. And I was all excited, and then nothing. And it was weird because the Canucks had just traded Glenn Hanlon there. And of course, they would have felt that they could make that move because Richard Brodeur had emerged as their starting goaltender. I personally, when I looked at their careers side by side, I always thought Hanlon was the better goalie of the two. But there was such a belief in Richard Brodeur in Vancouver because of the 1982 Stanley Cup final run. I can't really argue against why the team picked him over Hanlon, but I would still say of the two, I liked Hanlon a little bit better. Moving on, however, June 9th, 1982, St. Louis gets Rob Ramage, and here's where they made a mistake. Colorado gets a 1982 first and a 1983 first, which became John McClain. That Colorado is the one that became the New Jersey Devils. That's the Colorado Rockies. And it's one of the few trades the Colorado Rockies ever won. June 9th, 1984, St. Louis acquires Rick Walmsley, a 1984 second, which became Brian Benning, and another second, which became Tony Herkus, as well as a third that became Robert Dirk. Montreal only wanted 2 draft picks for that. The first rounder, which became Shane Corson, and a second rounder, which became Stéphane Richer. Are we up to date now on how many Montreal Canadian stars were taken that could have been St. Louis Blues stars? Because really, in all honesty, it's a large number. February 27th, 1985, St. Louis acquires Mark Johnson and Greg Millen. Hartford gets Mike Liut and Jorgen Pettersson. Very, very interesting trade at the time. I give the edge to Hartford because Liut was a very good goaltender for them. But Liut kind of had that flash-in-the-pan look to him by that stage with St. Louis. He had one absolute MVP, fantastic best goalie in the league season that he never quite lived up to again in St. Louis. So at the time they traded him, I think they were also interested to see what Mark Johnson was going to be. June 15th, 1985, St. Louis gets Michael Dark, Mark Hunter, a 1985 second, third, which became Nelson Emerson, fifth, and a 1986 sixth-round draft pick. Montreal gets a 1985 first, second, fourth, fifth, and sixth. The only one that becomes anybody of consequence is that 6th round pick, which became Donald Dufresne. So Montreal takes a bunch of draft picks from St. Louis again, but St. Louis ends up winning the trade. Mark Hunter, pretty solid. And Emerson ended up becoming a pretty good NHL player as well. February 1st, 1986, St. Louis gets Eddie Beers, Charlie Bourgeois, and Gino Cavallini. Calgary gets Terry Johnson, Joe Mullen, and Rick Wilson. So that is heavily stilted in favor of the Calgary Flames, and they would go on to go to a Stanley Cup final with Joe Mullen in 86, and then win a Stanley Cup with Joe Mullen in 1989. So, honestly, still looking at this trade, I'm not too sure what St. Louis was thinking in this one at all. June 12th, 1987, we're up to that now. St. Louis gets a 1987 third, which became the Robert Nordmark. 1988 second, and Montreal gets a 1987 second, which became some guy named John LeClaire, and a 1988 fifth. Listen, St. Louis, when Montreal wants draft picks, you say no. It's really simple. The California Seals didn't learn their lesson, ended up having to move, in part because of those trades with Montreal. Montreal, very smart when it comes to acquiring draft picks. December 11th, 1987, because they already had Gino Cavallini, St. Louis says, why not have the brothers play together? They acquired Paul Cavallini, and Washington gets a 1988 second. So this is what will give St. Louis a compliment. The Cavallinis together, that was fun. It's fun to have Gino and Paul on the same team, and I think you can get brothers that get along, and they're good guys, they're good in the locker room. I really think it's a good idea to have them play together. Never understood why Vancouver didn't draft Valeri Bure when they had the chance. At the time, they tried to explain it, but it didn't make any sense to me then either. If you have two skilled brothers playing together, that could be fantastic. Even though in this case, Cavallini's would not have been directly playing with one another. I don't think they were on the ice at the same time very often, but still, being in the locker room together, on the bench together. March 7th, 1978, St. Louis acquires Steve Bozek and Brett Hull in exchange for Calgary getting Rob Ramage and Rick Walmsley. So, in both the Walmsley and Ramage trades, St. Louis loses. So in 1988, they make up for it by trading both players, and they acquire Brett Hull and Steve Bozek. Bozek, another one that's kind of a forgotten player, capable of 20 goals. And Brett Hull, 527 goals as a Blue. Pretty darn good player for guys that, yes, they helped Calgary get to the Stanley Cup final and win it. But Walmsley was a backup goaltender, and Ramage wasn't a top tier. I mean, he was a top four, but it's not like they were trading them Al McInnes. They would take Al McInnes, but we'll get to that. September 6, 1988, St. Louis gets Mike Bullard, Tim Corkery, and Craig Cox. Calgary gets Steve Bozek, so Bozek did not last as a member of the St. Louis Blues. Michael Dark, Doug Gilmour, and Mark Hunter. So almost as a way of saying, we robbed you taking Brett Hull. Here, have Doug Gilmour. So Gilmour goes to Calgary, and I'm going to say straight out, yeah, Calgary wins that deal because you've got Mark Hunter in that one too. June 15th, 1989, St. Louis gets Paul McLean and Adam Oates. Detroit gets Bernie Federko and Tony McKegney. Boy, howdy, did this backfire on Detroit badly. The idea was simple. You were adding Federko and McKegney, you were adding that veteran presence with the idea that those veterans working with Yzerman could maybe get them over the hump and get them into the playoffs. Nobody had any idea just how good Adam Oates was going to be. But the fact that McLean's thrown in, it's a mess. Absolute mess. June 13th, 1990, Jeff Courtnall ends up joining the Blues. Washington gets Mike Lawler and Peter Zezel. So that was a nice trade because it set up one about a year later. Not even a year later. St. Louis gets Garth Butcher and Dan Quinn. They were very big on these guys, believing Dan Quinn would be that help down the center. Or down the middle. I don't have to say down the center. Down the middle. And Garth Butcher was going to be that toughness that they needed on the blue line. That sandpaper. What they didn't realize at the time was Vancouver had ground Butcher down to almost nothing by the time that trade took place. He recovered shortly after that, the following season and whatnot, but man, Vancouver worked him into the ground. Vancouver acquired Jeff Courtnall, Robert Dirk, Sergio Momesso, Cliff Ronning, and a 1992 fifth-round draft pick. I've said, in recent videos, history videos, that a lot of the trades we look at as lopsided, it's very often ones where it's one or two players going one way and a whole bunch going the other. Odds are one of the guys out of that whole bunch you're going to regret trading. But for St. Louis, it was Courtnall, Momesso, and Ronning. All three they ended up regretting because you're trading away your depth. And that's essentially what St. Louis did in that deal. September 22nd, 1991. Murray Barron and Ron Sutter are acquired by St. Louis. Philadelphia gets Rod Brind'Amour and Dan Quinn. So Dan Quinn did not last in St. Louis at all. This is when Dan Quinn starts circulating around the league. And Rod Brind'Amour is going to Philly. And they get back Ron Sutter and Murray Barron. Now, no shade whatsoever at Ron Sutter. An excellent, hardworking 20-goal scorer. Or at Murray Barron, who was a tough blue liner as well. And having Barron and Butcher on the blue line, that's a blue line that'll keep other teams honest. But trading out Brind'Amour shortly after trading out Courtnall, Momesso, Ronning, you guys get the picture. The talent level would be dropping at that stage. February 7th, 1992, St. Louis acquires Craig Janney and Stefan Quintal. Boston gets Adam Oates. Boston wins this trade going away. At the time, St. Louis, there was a prickly relationship between Blues management and Adam Oates. Oates was very publicly critical of some things. And so, out you go. Boston said, we'll take the trouble off your hands. Just take Craig Janney and Stefan Quintal. And Janney was not Adam Oates. He could score points, but he was not an Adam Oates. September 24th, 1993, St. Louis acquires Phil Housley. Winnipeg gets Nelson Emerson and Stefan Quintal. So, Phil Housley, member of the Blues there. They've had a lot of all-star / Hall of Fame defensemen on their blue line. Before Nashville was in the league, St. Louis is kind of where almost everybody who was anybody who, as a defenseman, had played. January 23rd, 1994, St. Louis acquires Denny Chassé, and Steve Duchesne, which continues that idea that really good defensemen are at least passing through St. Louis. Quebec gets Bob Basson, Garth Butcher, and Ron Sutter. So Butcher's time in St. Louis ends up being roughly 3 years before he's moved on to the Quebec Nordiques. July 4th, 1994, St. Louis acquires Al MacInnis. There's one of those great defensemen as well. 1997 fourth. Calgary gets Phil Housley, a 1996 second, and a 1997 second. Again, I favor St. Louis in this one because I like MacInnis more than I like Housley. Definitely not an insult to Housley, as MacInnis was just that good. He had a lethal slap shot. July 27th, 1995, St. Louis acquires Chris Pronger. Hartford gets Brendan Shanahan. So another great defenseman coming into St. Louis. August 4th, 1995, St. Louis acquires a 1996 first, which became Marty Reisner. First, in 1997, was acquired as well. Edmonton gets Curtis Joseph and the rights to Mike Greer. So Cujo exits St. Louis. There were a lot of mad Blues fans at the time, and I was a person who wasn't happy either because I felt like, with the Blues he might be able to win, and I didn't feel like with the Oilers he was going to win. And Cujo I cheered for no matter where he went. I didn't care what jersey he was wearing. I just wanted to see him win, and looking back, one of the greatest disappointments for me as a hockey fan was Cujo not winning a Stanley Cup. February 27th, 1996, St. Louis acquires Wayne Gretzky. LA gets Craig Johnson, Patrice Tardif, Roman Vopat, a 1996 fifth, and the 1997 first that St. Louis had acquired from Edmonton. That became Matt Zoltek, so I didn't feel like I had to write his name on the board. So for Gretzky as a rental, they paid what looked like an okay price at the time, but we all kind of understood that this was kind of second tier when it came to prospects. And again, LA was probably looking and going, all right, well, we'll take a bunch, and figuring one of them was going to work out, and it just really didn't. March 15th, 1996, St. Louis acquires Craig Mctavish. Philadelphia gets Dale Hawerchuk. Hawerchuk was disappointing for St. Louis after signing a big contract. I don't know that Gretzky necessarily had a hand in them going out and getting McTavish, but I'm guessing that Keenan did. So again, we're trying to put the Oilers into a position where they can win when they're not in Edmonton, and it didn't work out too well for St. Louis. November 27th, 1996, St. Louis gets Pavel Demitra. Ottawa gets Christer Olsen. This trade wasn't given any attention really at the time. Demitra didn't look like he was going to be a whole lot at the NHL level, and then he gets to St. Louis, and then, of course, he's on the board with 493 points in his career for St. Louis. He ended up being a pretty good player. Christer Olsen, no, wasn't really, not at the NHL level anyways. June 20th, 1999, St. Louis acquires Roman Turek from Dallas for a 1999 second-round pick. I remember as a Dallas fan at the time going, great, we got robbed. I liked Roman Turek a lot. I thought, Belfour's not going to last forever. Turek, it looked like, was going to be the heir apparent, and then they moved on from him and drove me nuts. March 13th, 2001, St. Louis acquires Corey Stillman. Calgary gets Craig Conroy in a 2001 7th-round pick, which became David Moss. Conroy became a pretty big name in Calgary and had some affinity for passes back and forth with Iginla. So I think that was a trade that benefited both sides. March 13th, 2001, St. Louis gets Keith Tkachuk. Phoenix gets Michael Handzus, Ladislav Nagy, a 2002 first, which became Ben Eager, and Jeff Tafe. Tkachuk, pretty darn good player in his day. Ends up scoring 427 points as a member of the St. Louis Blues. June 30th, 2001, St. Louis acquires Michael Reason and Doug Waite. Edmonton gets Jochen Hecht, Jan Horacek, and Marty Reisner. So that first-round pick, Reisner, ends up going to Edmonton anyways. And Doug Waite is really, of course, the big name there. June 21st, 2003, St. Louis gets a 2003 second, which became David Backes. Tampa Bay gets Corey Stillman. So the Tampa Bay Lightning looking to put together a win. They end up doing that. Corey Stillman gets a Stanley Cup in 2004, and of course he'd move on and get another one in 2006 with the Hurricanes. August 2nd, 2005, St. Louis gets Eric Brewer, Doug Lynch, and Jeff Wojciechowski, which is not enough because Edmonton got Chris Pronger. Brewer, though, had a decent enough career. Brewer, I think the expectations were too high for him. Coming out of junior and just some of his international play, I think people expected more out of him than he was going to provide. But it's not enough for giving up Chris Pronger. February 27th, 2007, St. Louis gets Jay Barabal, Ville Nieminen, and a 2007 first, which became David Perron. San Jose gets Bill Guerin. I'm going to go ahead and say that's a trade that favors St. Louis. Also, February 27, 2007, St. Louis gets Brad Boyes. Boston gets Dennis Wideman. And my frustration and my Tourette's with Dennis Wideman would start pretty quick after that as a Bruins fan. I know there are people who liked him in Boston. I used to hear compliments from announcers during Boston games, and I'd be yelling at the TV. I remember there was one night that I was watching a game, and I swear Chara had bailed out Wideman 3 or 4 times. And Bob Cole says, and tonight, Chara has to feel great having Wideman on the other side helping him out. And I yelled at the TV, what? I went nuts. Anyways, that being said, June 22nd, 2017, St. Louis gets a first-round pick, which becomes Lars Eller, a second and a 2008 third-round pick. San Jose gets a 2007 first as well, and it becomes Logan Couture. So San Jose trades up in the draft. They get a great player. Eller, decent enough player that St. Louis would trade and do pretty well in that trade as well. November 24th, 2008, St. Louis gets Carlo Colaiacovo and Alex Steen from Toronto for Lee Stempniak. Colaiacovo, if not for injury, I think would have been a pretty darn good NHL defenseman, but injury derailed his career. And of course, Alex Steen is still a member of the team, still adding to that career total of 479 points with St. Louis. He is not the offensive player that he was when they acquired him back in 2008, but he's still a useful player, and he's got a cup ring. And Lee Stempniak has played for, I want to say 10 teams. I think it's 10. Which would be one off Mike Sillinger's record of 11. It's 9 or 10 teams, I know. June 17th, 2010, St. Louis gets Jaroslav Halak. Montreal gets Lars Eller and Ian Schultz. So, Jaroslav Halak coming out of a fantastic run with the Montreal Canadiens in 2010. Montreal trades him to St. Louis. That took so much guts for Montreal management to do that. To go, we're gonna go with Price. We know Halak's your hero, but we're gonna go with Price. And Montreal fans didn't receive it well. And I remember the preseason of 2010-2011, Price had a really bad game, and the fans booed him, and he kind of laughed it off, which showed why Carey Price was really the right decision to make. Nothing gets to Carey Price. He doesn't look nervous either, St. Louis fans. June 17th, 2010. Nope, June 25th, 2010. St. Louis gets a first-round draft pick, which became Vlad Tarasenko, and Ottawa gets David Rundblad. I'm not going to say that makes up for all the other bad draft picks that they lost, that they should have kept. But yeah, it probably makes up for all the bad draft picks they lost and they should have kept. I'm not sure what Ottawa was thinking. I never saw it with David Rundblad. I never saw, but he moved around a bit, and teams clearly thought he was going to get it together. February 18th, 2011, St. Louis gets a 2011 third-round pick, which became Jordan Binnington and Brock Bookeboom. Tampa Bay gets Eric Brewer. So if you're going to make up for losing Pronger, you're going to make up for probably not getting enough back. Trade Eric Brewer 6 years later and get back a goaltender that'll lead you to a Stanley Cup. That definitely helps. So St. Louis, again, making up for some foibles they had when it came to trades previously. And this is part of how you build a Stanley Cup winner, is drafting smartly. So notice Binnington's a third-rounder. Draft smartly. And, of course, Brock Bookeboom, we're still waiting for the NHL level. It's a great name. Pretty sure that's Jeff's kid. And it would have been great to see him at the NHL level because Brock Bookeboom. February 26, 2012, St. Louis gets a 2013 second-round pick. Ottawa gets Ben Bishop. Never understood why teams get rid of Ben Bishop. I don't get it. April 1st, 2013, St. Louis gets Jay Bouwmeester. Calgary gets a 2013 fourth. Mark Condary, Rito Berra, and a 2013 first, which when I looked at was Emile Poirier, and I'm like, I'll leave that. I'll just leave that off the board. So yeah, Jay Bouwmeester, pretty good player for St. Louis again, building a Stanley Cup winner in that fashion. July 2nd, 2015, St. Louis gets Troy Brouwer. Phoenix Copley, a 2016 third. Washington gets TJ Oshie. So, trade that Washington would be pretty happy with. Oshie ends up winning a Stanley Cup there. But you look at it, St. Louis wins the Stanley Cup themselves 4 years later, so they're probably not too upset about losing Oshie. July 1st, 2018, St. Louis gets Ryan O'Reilly. Buffalo gets Vladimir Sobotka. Patrick Berglund. Tage Thompson, a 2019 first and a 2021 second. And, of course, that's a great way to finish this off because the Ryan O'Reilly trade means that you get yourself a Stanley Cup. He gets himself a Conn Smythe. And St. Louis fans no longer have to hear about how the St. Louis Blues can't win a Stanley Cup. Because they have, and they're in a position where they could win it again. But with the amount of parity we have in the NHL, it's just impossible to tell. So there you go. The history of the St. Louis Blues from 1967 through now. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. Just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching and for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.